Some breakups announce themselves with fireworks and tears, but the most devastating ones arrive in cold silence that is the death knell for any lasting relationship. Have you ever felt your heart shatter into 1,000 pieces waiting for a text that never comes, only to be met by the void of a blank screen? In today's world, where every encounter is filtered and polished for social media, few speak of that sudden vanishing act by someone who once held your world together. They don't argue, they don't shout, they don't even shed a single tear, they simply disappear. And the cruelest pain isn't realizing they're gone, it's admitting you enabled the growing distance. You pardoned every canceled date, every unanswered message, every retreat back into their self-protective shell. You clung to promises of change, sacrificing your own peace for the roller coaster of emotional whiplash. Then one day, not in an outburst of anger, but in utter exhaustion, you fall silent. You finally see it. Love without reciprocity isn't love, it's self-destruction. You resolve to never reopen your heart to someone who can't or won't cherish it. In that stillness, you uncover a profound truth. Boundaries aren't barriers, they're armor. That quiet departure becomes your greatest lesson. Prioritize self-love over endless, waiting for a love that never arrives. If this is your story, if that silence still sends a chill down your spine, pause and ask yourself, do I have the courage to put myself first once and for all? In that moment, every sound seemed to fade. No longer the ping of a waiting message, no longer the sigh of disappointment, only the profound silence of a decision made. The anxious partner had lived within the push and pull cycle of the avoidant. Each text sent was fueled by hope for a sweet reply. Each meeting was charged with yearning for a lingering touch, and each withdrawal was chased with desperate pursuit. But now, after countless times of their heart shattering over last-minute cancellations and promises that never materialized, they realized they had reached the final limit of exhaustion. Their craving for closeness had ceased to be motivation. It had become the very shackle binding them to repeated hurt. They had forgiven too often. They had endured for too long. And in the process, they had lost themselves trying to fill the emptiness the other left behind. Crossing that threshold did not erupt in tears or shouts as one might expect. Instead, they quietly closed the invisible notebook of expectations. No more, I'll wait for your reply. No more, I think we'll be okay. Only a silent resolve burning within. They knew that if they continued, they would only circle back to old wounds. And this time, those wounds might never heal. In that instant of stillness, they tapped into a hidden power, the power of self-preservation, of setting boundaries with both themselves and the one who had hurt them. That silence was not a meaningless void, but a transitional chord moving from despair toward new hope. They no longer needed explanations, proof, or validation that their love deserved fairness. They relinquished the need to decode mixed signals, relinquished the effort to justify the avoidant's strange behavior, relinquished the belief that if given enough time, miracles would occur. Instead, they took a deep breath of freedom, not freedom found in another, but the freedom of reclaiming their own buried identity. They began stepping forward with resolute thoughts. I deserve to be treated fairly. I deserve love without having to pay too high a price. Every plan for the coming weekend no longer involved the avoidant. Every dream for a shared future no longer hinged on awaiting a hopeful glance. In its place, they reallocated their time to themselves, for honest coffee dates with friends, for pages that offered new insights, for short journeys that let them breathe in spaces where their heart was no longer caged. Perhaps the avoidant would not recognize this transformation at first. They were accustomed to intense reactions, to tearful pleas for a return, to promises of change. This time, they met a vast silence, a mirror reflecting every lost fragment of trust. This was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of someone who had learned to heal themselves, who understood that silence can be the most powerful response of all. Within that quietness lay thousands of simultaneous realizations, the understanding that love is sometimes less about clinginess and more about knowing when to let go, the insight that one's worth does not depend on whether another stays, the awareness that departing is not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter filled with peace. This departure, though silent, resounded fiercely. It echoed the longing for freedom, the force of self-protection, the steadfast belief that placing oneself first is the truest form of flourishing. And so, in that serene moment, the decisive turning point was etched not by harsh words, but by a wordless act. The anxious partner no longer chased the figure that had caused their pain. They stopped, only to see a new path illuminated ahead. That silence became their lighthouse, guiding their heart toward genuine tranquility. After that decisive moment of silence, the anxious partner stepped into a new journey, exploring the vicious cycle of the anxious-avoidant relationship. Up to that point, they had given so much without receiving their due. They accepted every tiny crumb of affection, a brief morning text, a rushed "I miss you" before the screen went dark, a fleeting hug when their partner felt vulnerable. Those crumbs were like breadcrumbs of hope, enough to sustain their longing, but not nearly enough to fill the hunger for security. Whenever the avoidant partner brushed their hand against theirs, it became a moment of reassurance, proof that "I am still loved." But the instant closeness turned threatening when a sincere glance appeared, when a trembling voice betrayed a need to share. The avoidant would contract, retreating behind their invisible shield. Every retreat triggered a severe emotional starvation in the anxious partner. They chased the next crumb like an addict, pursuing a fleeting high. Calls just to hear a voice, messages just to see the scene mark, hugs just to satisfy the need for touch. They poured their entire hearts and minds into the relationship, while the avoidant merely took enough to keep them around, then withdrew before any real bond could form. This warm-cold cycle played out day after day like a broken record, awakening both hope and pain. The anxious partner rationalized the erratic behaviors. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they're afraid of my pressure. Maybe if I'm more patient, they will open up. They convinced themselves that each withdrawal was a test to prove their love's worth. They accepted the pain, believing that if they endured a little longer, the relationship would turn a corner. In truth, it was not a test, but a deliberate avoidance, a protective reaction from the avoidant partner to maintain a safe distance, where they need not confront their own raw emotion. Their pullback was not merely psychological reflex, but a mighty barrier preventing any episode of genuine closeness. Therefore, the anxious partner became the architect of fragile hope. They built all belief on shaky foundations. A delayed message, a minor gesture of care, a sudden appearance. Each crumb was a ticket to an illusionary world where they felt worthy. But that world was unsustainable. It vanished as soon as the partner withdrew, leaving behind emptiness and bewilderment. They would do anything: midnight calls, novel-length texts, surprise visits, just to reclaim that slender hope. The resulting void was so intense that the anxious partner was willing to sacrifice themselves, sidelining friends, family, personal interests, work everything to focus on a relationship that offered only shards of affection. They told themselves this was a necessary sacrifice, proof of genuine love, evidence they were not like those who walked away in times of trouble. Yet that very sacrifice eroded their self-worth. Ultimately, they recognized themselves as a lantern bearer, tirelessly shining into the dark, seeking any sign of life from the avoidant partner. Each flicker of affection made them forget the times they had been abandoned. But whenever their partner fell silent, darkness swallowed them again, leaving them utterly powerless. They fell into exhaustion, not physical, but neurological, emotional, soulful exhaustion. It was then that realization dawned. They could no longer sustain this cycle, but to break free, they had to confront the truth. Crumbs of affection are mere scraps, incapable of substituting wholehearted love. Pouring all energy into someone who does not reciprocate is self-destruction. They needed to learn to respect themselves rather than forgive unconditionally, to build boundaries instead of illusions, to rediscover intrinsic worth rather than depend on a stranger's gaze. Thanks to that decisive silence, they granted themselves permission to halt this cycle, to refuse crumbs of affection, to allow real distance, to protect their emotional energy. And that became the opening step toward learning self-love, deriving happiness from within rather than from the fragments of an incomplete relationship. After seeing clearly the cycle of crumbs and futile efforts to soothe emotional hunger, the anxious partner enters the next stage, recognizing their breaking point and embracing the final blow. At first, they treated each moment of being ignored as a minor test, but gradually it became a deep wound in their heart. They grew accustomed to sacrificing themselves, accepting prolonged silence, and even justifying the avoidance thoughtlessness with, "They must be busy," or "They care for me in their own way." But one day, not with an explosion of anger, but through a casually disrespectful act, a promise dissolving into thin air, an important message being snubbed, or an absence precisely when they longed for sharing became the straw that broke the camel's back. That final blow did not shout or shove. It was simply the avoidant choosing complete silence once again. In that moment, the anxious partner's heart stopped racing with insecurity. It stilled like a glassy lake. They did not weep or scream, but felt an illuminating truth, that clarity. This clarity was more powerful than any burst of anger, because it was not an instantaneous reaction, but the culmination of hundreds of endured trials, thousands of moments asking whether they were still worth fighting for. In that instant, they felt their right to respect, their right to wholehearted love, and their right to set boundaries for themselves. The tolerance limit is not a tangible number or a specific timeline, but a deep soul point where they realize that continuing to accept disrespect is self-destruction. They heard an inner voice, enough. That voice was not harsh, but clear and resolute, guiding them out of the darkness of doubt. Rather than retaliating with harsh words, they responded with meaningful silence. No more calls, no more texts, no more explanations. They reserved that space for themselves, to reorganize their thoughts, to listen to their soul's true needs. It is precisely that moment of enough that ignites inner strength. The anxious partner not only stops chasing attention, but also stops faulting themselves for believing in empty promises. They acknowledge the pain they endured, but they refuse to let it shape their future. What they reclaim is not a fiery rage, but a steadfast calm, the calm of someone who has been through pain and learned to love themselves before loving another. They need no dramatic display of emotion to validate their decision. Silence alone conveys that they choose boundaries and self-respect over tragedy and endless struggle. From then on, that clarity becomes a lighthouse for a new journey. Each day, when they no longer receive signals from the avoidant, they do not wonder, "What did I do wrong?" but instead celebrate, "I deserve so much more than this." They begin to rebuild the garden of their soul, nurturing nourishing relationships, rekindling old passions, and rediscovering dreams that lay dormant. Their tolerance limit has transformed into the driving force, propelling them forward not to prove anything to anyone, but to ascend to the freest and fullest version of themselves. And so, the anxious partner's life no longer revolves around patchwork crumbs, but toward genuine connection. They have transcended the final crack of illusory hope to find an inner clarity not born of anger, but born of self-worth awakening and the longing for true love. From that moment of clarity and stillness, the anxious partner did not erupt in accusations or sudden drama, but began a silent withdrawal, a step-by-step retreat of emotional energy, quiet yet powerful. First, they completely stopped tracking signals. No more scrutinizing whether their partner had seen a message. No more clinging to the blue tick or a timestamp. Every notification that once sparked anxiety was met with a deep breath and the resolve. "This time, I refuse to let my emotions hinge on a tiny blue check." Alongside ceasing signal, watching, they also halted all justifications for the avoidance behavior. No more excuses of, "They must be busy at work," "They're worried about family," or "They love me in their own way." They admitted plainly that no excuse justifies being left hanging, being met with silence, or being treated disrespectfully. With the emotional wellspring no longer poured into that relationship, they turned inward. They launched the next phase by creating a concrete plan for their days, weeks, even months ahead. What were once nights spent waiting for a call were now filled with meaningful tasks. A tranquil morning of meditation and journaling, an afternoon stroll in the park to breathe fresh air, an evening dedicating time to learn a new skill, cooking, painting, or even basic language lessons. Planning not only restored a sense of control, but gave them a tangible purpose to wake up for each morning. Next, they devoted themselves to self-care in simple yet practical ways. Sleep became a top priority, establishing a routine of going to bed early, powering down devices half an hour before sleep, and reading a soothing book instead of mindlessly scrolling feeds. Meals were thoughtfully prepared: fresh vegetables, balanced nutrients, adequate protein and vitamins to nourish the body and sharpen the mind. They exercised regularly, perhaps gentle yoga to release tension, or outdoor running to boost endorphins and bring natural exhilaration. Each step reinforced that they deserved care and love. Beyond this, the anxious partner proactively rekindled other relationships, longtime friends, trusted colleagues, and even new acquaintances from community events, classes, or hobby groups. They invested quality time in genuine, unhurried conversations without expectation, simply connecting. Laughter-filled coffee dates, short trips with friends, or intimate dinners all reminded them that they were not alone and that life still held many hues waiting to be discovered. Parallel to rebuilding their social circle, they began nurturing personal passions and goals, finishing a half-written book, painting their first canvas of the year, or planning that dream vacation. Each intention silently declared that their life was not defined by disappointment or another's absence, but by the boundless opportunities for growth and joy. This quiet withdrawal, unseen by the avoidant, held a ripple effect of powerful change. When the avoidant eventually realized there were no more frantic messages or pleading explanations, they had to confront the void they themselves created. Meanwhile, the anxious partner walked confidently into their new path, with restored self-assurance, positive energy they had authored, and genuine connections they had rebuilt. Thus, from the resolute silence of the previous stage, they took an even stronger step through concrete action, withdrawing emotional energy, planning for themselves, nourishing body and soul, expanding social bonds, and cultivating their passion. This journey not only marked the end of painful cycles but also opened a brand new chapter 1, in which the anxious partner doesn't merely survive, but thrives more powerfully than ever before. As the anxious partner began to stride confidently on the path of independence, the avoidant partner quietly reached their own turning point, a turn filled with confusion and panic. Until now, they had relied on the anxious partner's predictable response as a safety net. Each time they withdrew, they knew the anxious partner would chase after them, eager to close the gap. But now, resolute silence sounded like a death knell. The avoidant no longer heard the footsteps of pursuit, only the echoing emptiness. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they awoke in the night without finding a "I miss you" or "Are you okay?" message. They stared at the phone, hands trembling, a profound emptiness washing over them. Their minds spun. Why isn't there a message? Why no tap on the screen now? These thoughts were more than mere disappointment. They were fear dawning of losing their familiar power. They realized their role as the one who could retreat at will was now unsteady. Panic began to infiltrate every daily action. First came an unusual spurt of frantic messaging. They typed long paragraphs and sent them in haste, desperate for an immediate reply. They monitored phone logs, waiting minute by minute for the seen indicator. When no reply came, they shifted tactics, retreating into even deeper silence to manufacture a deliberate void. They hoped this quiet would trigger a redoubled chase. Yet now, the silence did not prompt pursuit. Instead, it deepened their confusion. They had no idea what mistake they'd made. In panic, many avoidants pivoted suddenly to unexpected warmth. A text saying, "Hey, I've been thinking about you," a phone call asking, "How are you doing?" or even invitations for tea or dinner. While these gestures seemed sincere, their hidden aim was to test the waters, to see if the anxious partner still reflexively rushed back. But the anxious partner, having learned to maintain distance, no longer responded with the same intensity. They replied politely, but deliberately delayed, setting clear boundaries on time and intimacy. All these attempts proved fruitless. The avoidant hesitated, uncertain whether to persist or retreat further. They feared it was too late to rekindle the connection. They felt a void not just externally, but internally, where crumbs of affection once patched up wound. Now those scraps were gone, exposing the raw core of hurt they had long concealed. Driven by fear and confusion, they embarked on a series of failed experiments, scrolling the anxious partner's social media, asking mutual friends for news, even showing up unexpectedly with flowers or gifts to spark an emotional reaction. All met with cold silence, messages unanswered, calls ignored, doors firmly closed. Each failure only reinforced the anxious partner's clarity and left the avoidant more bewildered at their lost control. Eventually, they realized they could not recreate the old cycle. Panic yielded no results, and every control tactic faltered against their partner's newly found inner freedom. They faced powerlessness for the first time in their lives. They could not manipulate another's emotions, could not use selective closeness or distance to keep someone by their side. It was precisely in this ultimate confusion that they touched the beginning of genuine change. They had to learn to forge sustainable connections, to take responsibility for their own emotions instead of relying on another's reactions. And that journey paved the way to earned security, where the anxious partner not only can let go, but the avoidant must also confront themselves and embark on their own path of inner growth. From the confusion and failed reconciliation attempts, we now enter a completely new chapter, the concept of earned security. This is not just a dry academic term, but a vibrant testament to the profound inner transformation of the anxious partner after long, tumultuous days, realizing that accepting crumbs of affection and chasing the avoidant only wrought repeated pain. They began to seek a safe foundation within themselves, a stable inner security, independent of any signal, gesture, or promise from their partner. First and foremost, earned security is the ability to self-soothe. Rather than waiting for a call or acknowledgement, they learn to calm their anxiety through simple yet powerful techniques. Deep breathing during moments of stress, short mindfulness practices to settle the mind, or journaling to release pent-up emotions. Whenever the void beckoned, they no longer looked at their phone for answers, but turned inward, listened to their true needs, and dissolved distress with positive self-affirmations. I am okay. I am worthy. I am strong enough. Next, they built inner stability, a mental state that remains balanced despite external turbulence. Picture it as a sturdy building within the soul, with a foundation of self-respect and walls of belief in one's own value. When faced with choices of acceptance or departure, they no longer wavered between hope and fear, but reinforced their conviction. Whatever happens, I can stand firm. In this way, they generated an inner gravitational pull that prevented negative emotions from easily toppling their equilibrium. Boundary setting is an indispensable component of earned security. After long periods of limitless giving, they now clearly defined their limits. Certain behaviors were unacceptable, certain actions unforgivable, and certain signals no longer ignorable. Establishing boundaries affirmed their right to protect their emotional and mental space. I will not reply to messages after 24 hours. I will not tolerate empty promises. I will not remain on hold. Each boundary declared, I am worthy enough not to chase unworthy things. Finally, earned security also entails relinquishing the deeply held belief that love is a relentless battlefield to be conquered. Previously, they thought they had to sacrifice everything and persistently fight for every bit of closeness to maintain the relationship. Now, they understand that love is not an arena, but a duet of mutual resonance. Love requires no unilateral effort. It arises from harmony, respect, and shared emotional responsibility. When they no longer engage in that struggle, love becomes serene, gentle, and natural. This transformation makes it impossible to revert to the old role of the powerless pursuer. Earned security is not a momentary epiphany, but a gradual process of fortifying the self, of daily nurturing inner strength. They not only end the anxious, avoidant cycle, but also open themselves to healthy love, where both partners can give and receive in balance. The role of the chaser is replaced by the calm, confident individual, whose heart is strong enough to love without fear and wise enough to walk away when love is no longer healthy. From this earned security, the anxious partner not only frees themselves, but also becomes a beacon for anyone lost in the labyrinth of emotions. They prove that no barrier is more formidable than the one between fear and self-belief. Once earned security is unlocked, anxiety loses its power. They become the freest version of themselves, ready to love, ready to trust, and ready to let go, all from a place of unwavering peace and strength. In the end, after a long journey from the decisive silence, breaking the cycle of crumbs, facing the final blow, to silently withdrawing and cultivating earned security, the anxious partner has ascended to a new level of self-love and self-worth. They no longer need their partner as the measure of their value. They possess the capacity to generate joy, safety, and meaning from within. The separation is no longer an indelible wound, but a transformative turning point, a beginning for a fuller, freer life. At the same time, the avoidant partner, deprived of their accustomed bait for emotional manipulation, is compelled to face their own consequences, loss, loneliness, and the necessity of self-reflection. In that moment, not through reproach but through the powerful reality of the anxious partner's silence, they gain the chance to take responsibility, heal themselves, and build genuine connection. Through earned security, the anxious partner stands as a living testament that love need not be an exhausting struggle, but rather a journey of empathy, respect, and mutual companionship.